of people waiting here, so. Well, I love seeing this number just climb and climb. So we're going to be broadcasting on Zoom here, of course, and we're dual broadcasting on Facebook Live, so we should have a nice reach here. All right. We'll just let it go for about 1 minute more.
Great.
All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everybody. Welcome to a Magic City Books virtual event. We've been doing lots of virtual events over the last few months, and we've been really mostly doing them on Monday nights and Thursday nights, just to kind of give you some sense of normality and a schedule and something to look forward to in your life. That being said, we did one last night because sometimes things just pop up, but we are trying to keep to that schedule, and we have been so looking forward to this one in specific. But I want to tell you a couple of things coming up before we get going. And you can go to our website, magiccitybooks.com, and see our full schedule. We have virtual events lined up mostly through August now, and actually starting to get some September events in there. And we'll be probably doing them this way for a little while. We want to make sure that we're being smart and safe, and you know, probably at some point rolling in-person events back into the mix. But even then, we'll have kind of a hybrid model for a while. But and almost all the events are free and open to the public, but one we have coming up on July 2nd is also a free one. That's with Emma Straub, another Riverhead author. That's going to be on July 2nd. Emma, of course, also is a bookseller with Books Are Magic in Brooklyn. On the 1st, I'm going backwards here. On July 1st, we have Laura Prescott for her wonderful book, The Secrets We Kept. And then on July 6th, we're going to be talking with Colson Whitehead for the Nickel Boys. And one of the cool things about that is the moderator for that event is going to be a guy named Ben Montgomery, who is a journalist for the Tampa Bay Times. And Ben is an Oklahoma native, and we've done some work with him before. But Ben is the journalist who wrote the stories that Colson found to inspire the story of the Nickel Boys. So that should be a good time. It's the first time they've done an in-person conversation or a conversation about the book. So that is a ticketed event, and half of that money goes to the John Hope Franklin Center for Reconciliation here in Tulsa, which is a wonderful organization dedicated to exactly what it says, reconciliation, and really important work, especially in light of the world we're living in right now. So check that out, July 6th, and you can see the full schedule at magiccitybooks.com. Our guest moderator for tonight is our good friend Carissa Kellerby of the Tulsa City-County Library. Carissa is one of our original team members at Magic City Books, so she kind of has like the OG status for Magic City Books. So we're very excited to have her here. She's moderated quite a few events. Was the last one, let's see, was it Aaron Morgenstern, and then we did Fiona Davis, was that one too? We've done a bunch.
And the last one I did was Ruthie Thorpe.
Yeah, that's right.
So yeah.
Yeah, so we've had a great time, and we always appreciate Carissa's time. This is kind of, I guess, our second event with Brit, if this really counts. We actually did a real human being in-person event with Brit, I believe in the fall of 2017 at the Central Library for her wonderful debut novel, The Mothers. And I think we all knew at that moment that whatever the next thing was going to be, and The Mothers was like a big, big debut book. It was like on every list you can imagine. It was probably like the dream of what anybody would want for their debut. And to follow that up with this and squash the whole notion of sophomore slump, that doesn't even exist. It's just like a never-ending ascension here for Brit Bennett. #1 New York Times-bestselling. I'm just going to embarrass the hell out of her. It's a pretty amazing feat to have 2 for 2 on this level. So for those of you who have not had a chance to read The Vanishing Half, you're really going to have your socks knocked off. We'll be posting links throughout the talk in the chat there, so you can get a copy or 2 if you'd like to read it more than once or give it to somebody else. And then we'll be taking your questions too. So Carissa will be kind of incorporating some of those throughout. So put those in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can, but I'm excited to just sit back and hear Carissa and Brit Bennett talk. So let's give a warm virtual Tulsa welcome to our very, very special guest, Brit Bennett. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Britt. I'm so excited to get to talk to you. I just finished your book, and I loved it. I loved both of your books, but this one I think even more so than the first, which, again, like Jeff was saying, no sophomore slump for you. So the tagline, or I guess the hook of this story, is twins inseparable as children ultimately choose to live in two very different worlds, one black and one white. So where did this story start for you? Where was the idea from?
Yeah, well, thank you, first of all. I'm glad that you enjoyed the second book. And thank you, Jeff, for that intro leading in. So for me, this really started with this place. It started with the town. And that came from a conversation I had with my mother a few years ago, when she mentioned very offhandedly a town that she remembered hearing about as a child, where everyone intermarried so that their children would get progressively lighter. And it was a sort of anecdote she told me very offhandedly, but it really struck me because it was so strange and distinctive, and just the notion of light skin being pursued in this way that's not just sort of a matter of preference or matter of like individual sort of individual interaction, but that's actually almost genetically engineered. There was something about that was so specific. So I immediately thought, this is the setting of a novel. But of course you need more than that for a novel. But that to me was really the launching point, was thinking about what it would be like to live in this place and leave this place or return to this place. And then from there, I started to think about the idea of these twins whose lives take them in opposite directions, kind of springing out from this very strange place.
So did you do research to find the name of that town that your mother kind of remembered? Did you ever learn any more about that, or did you just kind of go off of that idea?
Well, I did look it up, and I couldn't find it on a contemporary map. And that was what really hooked me. And the idea of this novel was that it became almost mythical at that point. It felt, the fact that it was a place that she remembered hearing about, but she had never actually seen or been to. It felt more interesting to me to think of it as a mythical place than to think about any type of, historical town. But at the same time, I did do some research. I found other similar towns of these Creole communities in Louisiana that were very insular, and maybe were not depicted in the same way that my mom said, but were similarly sort of sectioned, in this kind of no man's land of race, where they were apart from other Black people, but they also were not allowed into white society. So I was able to find some historical records of towns like that and drew on some of that to craft the town.
So I liked the description that you used early on to kind of talk about this pursuit of light skinned and marrying lighter and lighter skinned. You say that they wanted their children to be like a cup of coffee, steadily diluted with cream, a more perfect Negro, each generation lighter than the one before. So were they, in your mind, was that, one twin decides to pass as white and live her life that way, while the other one kind of goes the opposite direction and almost in a state of, or an idea of rebellion against that upbringing, marries a very dark man. And so they each have their own sort of defiance of that upbringing. But did you feel that the idea of this, trying to get lighter and lighter skin, was it for the goal of trying to pass as white eventually? Or do you think it was just they were wanting to still be Black but have lighter skin?
Yeah, to me, that was a thing that was interesting about it, was the idea in this town and in the way that I rendered in the book, that the idea of passing as white is also shameful. So the goal is not to pass as white. That's something that's looked down upon, but the goal is also not to be darker, because that's also looked down upon. So again, it's remaining in that third space of race that people are trying to kind of negotiate, of this like aspiration towards lightness, but never quite achieving whiteness, but also not being in this place of blackness and being in that weird kind of liminal space. To me, that became interesting. And I think also just because of the idea that within this book, you know, these are not elite people. These are not people who are hoping that lightness will bring them wealth and status. You know, it's a small, poor farm town. So nobody in this town is able to really capitalize in a sort of material way from being light. But it's just that the idea of lightness as being a virtue into, like, unto itself, that is what people are trying to gain, even if it doesn't materially change their life in any meaningful way. And you see early on in the book, there's this moment of racist violence that happens to a lighter skinned character, and his lightness does not save him from that type of violence. So to me, I became really interested in all of these absurdities of race, and that was just one absurdity that I wanted to explore, is the idea of pursuing lightness, not for any sense of material gain, but just for its own sake.
So we had a comment in the chat that I saw that I meant to address at the beginning. So I'm going to not include any spoilers. I'm going to try very hard not to ask any questions about spoilers. So if you haven't read the book yet, it's not, nothing is going to be ruined for you. So don't worry about that. And hopefully some of you, so this was our June pick for our subscription box for our fiction. Cool. So hopefully some of you have gotten that and been able to read it. But for those of you who haven't, yes, Jane, I see you're 75% done. I will not ruin the ending for you. I will
try also not to spoil. I will try to be very vague.
So we had another question in the Q&A. So did you, was the story being intergenerational, intentional from the conception of the book?
No. So I originally thought, I knew I wanted to write about these twin sisters. I originally thought there would be kind of a part A with one twin and a part B with the other twin, and that would be that. I think that what kind of surprised me as I was working on the book was the idea of their daughters, who became increasingly interesting to me. So on the opening page, you see Desiree returning to this town with her daughter, Jude, who is dark-skinned and resembles her father. And from the onset, I was really fascinated. What is the experience of Jude growing up in this place? Like, what is it like? It's one thing for Desiree and Stella, who fit the ideal of this town and rebel against it in some ways, but also are accepted as part of the town. It's very different than the experience of Jude would be as somebody who is considered just just completely on the outside of what is acceptable in this place. So from the opening, that Jude is one of the first characters you see on the page, and I became really fascinated about what her experience would be like in this place. But even beyond that, I think as I started thinking more deeply into the book, I don't think this is a spoiler, but Stella also has a child, has a daughter, and who becomes somebody who's completely different than anybody in this family. And I became more deeply interested in Stella's daughter and thinking about how these cousins are similar, how they're different, how they're similar to their mothers, how they're different from their mothers. The idea of all of those different family relationships just kind of crept up on me. So it wasn't something that I planned. I thought it would be strictly just these twin sisters and nobody else. But I feel like usually when I'm writing, I get wrapped up in all of these other characters. I think I was telling my friend this, and she was like, that's just called being a novelist. Like, that's what novelists do. And sometimes you'll have some character that feels really minor, and then suddenly you just want to know everything about them. And I think that that's kind of what happened to me writing this book.
Yeah, and that was one thing that surprised me as I got into this book is, I was expecting, the twins and their story. But then you get into those other characters that I even hesitate to call them secondary characters, because their story was just as important to me as the twins. And characters like Reese was one of my favorite characters. And someone in the Q&A said that his relationship with Jude was one of his favorites, or one of their favorites too. So what was the inspiration for the character of Reese in particular? Because, you know, not only are you tackling, you know, the theme of race and identity, but you also touch on, you know, transgender experience as well. So where did that character come from for you?
Yeah, actually, Reese is the character that people talk to me about the most. It's obviously still very early on because the book has only been out for a few weeks, so that could change. But as far as people on Instagram and like, you know, people messaging me, it's like, I don't know, 70% just love for Reese. So, so you know, he's a character that I also just loved. I wanted to write a love story for Jude. I really wanted her to experience love and friendship and community, because those are not things that she experiences where she grows up because of the sort of circumstances of where she's growing up. So I really wanted to write a love story for her. And Reese kind of arrived, and I became interested in that relationship of how these two people who have experienced so much pain and violence and trauma can learn how to love each other and also how to love themselves. So that became really moving and interesting to me. And thinking about Reese, who's a character who reinvents himself in a book full of people that are reinventing themselves, but reinventing himself in a very different way than these other characters. You know, his journey is one towards affirmation versus even transformation, I would say. So I became really interested in his journey and how it was different than Stella's, but how he also experiences the sort of liberation and also the pain of change. You know, writing the book, I kept thinking about the ways in which changing into somebody else, it can be very liberating, but it also can be hard. It can be painful to the people that you sometimes leave behind, or the people who don't accept you when you're different. It can be painful for you in a new world or in a new life. So I kind of loved playing between that tension of the liberation and also the pain of change. And Reese, I thought, was a character who demonstrated that.
Yeah, definitely, very well. And in addition to change, like, there's a lot of choices that your characters make that define the rest of their lives, and they continue having to either keep choosing in that same direction, or, you know, get so far down that way that they can't choose anything else. Was that really important to you? It was a very realistic way of change, because it's like, you know, when we make choices, we don't know, you know, is it a good choice? Is it a bad choice? Are there good and bad choices?
Right.
Is that a really important theme that you wanted to carry through the story too?
Right. I mean, I think I'm always interested in the ways that small choices can lead to large ramifications in our lives. I know something I was interested in the mothers, and the idea of all of these different decisions that we make cause ripples. And, you know, I think in The Vanishing Half, I was interested in these moments of change that appear where you least expect them. For example, you know, Stella's decision to pass, those moments where she decides to do that are not these huge dramatic consequential moments. They're these kind of small moments of convenience, or these small moments of opportunity that she seizes, and eventually she gets they sort of bake into her life, and that becomes her real life. So I'm always fascinated with that, because I think, like you're saying, you don't see those moments creep up on you. When I think about turning points in my life, even so far, very few of them have been really major dramatic moments that announce themselves. They've all just been, you know, when I decided I didn't want to go to law school and I wanted to do an MFA, or, you know, something like that, which was not a huge dramatic decision, but just some sort of quiet decision you made yourself and set you on a different path. So I think I'm in general just interested in thinking about those moments, and as a writer, I'm interested in those moments. And within this book, I became kind of curious to find those pivot points in the story of when characters could go one way, but then they go a different way. And I'm always, you know, as a writer, I'm always interested in them going the way that's most interesting. I always want to pivot them towards what will be more tense, or what will be more challenging for them, what will be more difficult, because that's just fun to read about. So I kept looking for those those sort of quiet moments in the narrative where we could pivot towards a more exciting direction.
And I think you did a really good job of that too, in who makes what choice, because between the twins in particular, because Stella was more the quiet one, and she was, you know, the smart one, well behaved, she did good in school, whereas Desiree was more bold and, you know, kind of brash, and it was the one that you wouldn't have expected to make such a bold choice, who was the one who decided to try and pass as white, and the other is the one who ends up coming back to the town that
Right.
they run away from. So was that intentional? Did you start off with knowing which twin was going to be the one to do which life choice?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. I don't remember when I decided that. I don't remember consciously deciding that, really. But I do think it's interesting for the reason that you just described, this idea of them inverting in this way that's unexpected. And I think it's interesting also for the characters, because Stella does not think of herself as a bold person, and Desiree certainly does not think of Stella in that way. Right. So Desiree is kind of caught unaware that Stella does this really huge thing. And Stella also surprises herself by doing it, and I think also enjoys doing it, because she knows that it's the type of thing that she is not supposed to do. She's aware of the fact that she is transgressing, not only because she is, you know, transgressing these racial categories, but also she's transgressing like the personality that she has. And, you know, I've always, I love seeing characters do things like that. I think sometimes there are moments when characters kind of surprise you as you're writing it, and they do things that you don't expect. I think Stella was that type of character for me, of moments I'd be like, oh yeah, well, what if she does this totally thing that you would think that she would never do, and then she ends up doing it. So there are ways in which I think that's fun to write. But I think it's also, again, like I think that's what's also just interesting about being a person, because, you know, there are ways in which we think about the people that we know the most in the world and the people we care about, and you think, oh, so-and-so would never do that. But like, we don't know what people would do or have done. And that kind of disconnect between this intimacy that we think that we have with people, or this familiarity, and who they are, that's what we all deal with being alive and being in relationships. There's always that gap. So in this book, I was able to play with that gap, I think, and widen it more than these characters certainly expected.
Yeah. And you also have different parts of the story where you kind of clued us, maybe not clued us in, but you dropped little hints of how Stella ended up making that decision. It wasn't just a sudden, like, in, you know, heat of the moment sort of decision.
Sure.
She had gone to town with, I think it was Lou, and went into one of the museums, or I think a museum and a store, and just walked into the white entrance. And, you know, so she was kind of pushing those boundaries, you know, early on. And I thought that added a lot of depth, because she did find it exciting. And, you know, being that quiet person, you know, finding those little thrills adds an interesting dimension to that character type.
I think so. And I think it's a couple of things. I think, you know, there's that element of kind of hiding in plain sight, and that is thrilling to her, of getting away with something that you're not supposed to get away with. But I think also there is a part of her that kind of pushes up against the illogic of race, because that sort of question that she asks at one point, which is like, well, why does this person get to be white and I don't? Is a legit question, you know, like what does it actually mean to be white, or to be, or any of these categories? If she can walk into a room and be treated as a white person, then what does it mean to be white, you know? And that's right. That's like a legit question that I think she's asking. And, you know, I love the idea of her kind of holding her hands at the flame, and not sort of jumping into it whole hog, but kind of playing with it a bit to see what she can get away with, and testing the boundaries before she eventually commits to what will be this, you know, permanent sort of, this permanent commitment.
Yeah, and so the way that you tell the story was very unique too. It's in a non-linear sort of way, and you cover time from the 1950s all the way up into the 1990s, in different sections. And it's the way that you weave everything together, and when you introduce certain characters and things like that, it's crafted so well. How did you get that sort of flow with such a non-linear timeline?
Well, thank you. I always really appreciate when people compliment the structure, because that was the hardest thing I think to figure out. It took many, many drafts and a lot of sort of bashing my head against the wall trying to figure it out. For whatever reason, I just never felt that this was a linear book. And it was very different than my first book, because The Mothers was basically a coming of age story. It took place over, around 10 years of time. Like, you begin when she's in high school and you end when she's kind of a young professional. And that there was like a simplicity to that. With this one, I knew I wanted to start with Desiree returning to town. I had no idea where I wanted to end. And I knew that I wanted there to be some suspense about where Stella was. So I figured we weren't going to see her right away. And that was kind of vaguely what I knew. So it took a while to kind of figure out how to navigate through time, and not only how to navigate through time, but how to make it make sense to somebody else reading it, because I was making all of these leaps, and that was a lot of the work I did with my editor, where she's just like, wait, what, where are we? When are we? Like, why? And I remember we had lunch at one point, and I said, I was like, yeah, I guess I could have made the timeline a little simpler, a little bit more straightforward. And she just very politely laughed. And I was like, that kind of said it all, the process of how we tried to wrangle this into something that made some sense. But I think for me, it never felt like one timeline, because I think part of that is that it felt like there were so many different stories, and that these stories were not, it didn't feel like it was different parts of the same story, basically. It felt like they were different stories. And like, Stella's story felt so different than Desiree's story. And Jude's story felt different than Kennedy's story. And so it felt disingenuous to even have them existing in the same kind of chronology. I think in the beginning I tried doing a kind of, you see Desiree, then you see Stella, then you see Desiree, then you see Stella. And that like handing the story off back and forth just didn't feel right. It felt like there needed to be those gaps in time. It felt like there needed to be those distances that you're kind of, traveling around throughout the book, all these different locations you go to that are all very separate and distinct from each other. That felt like the most natural way to tell the story. And I think in part because it's a fractured timeline, and it's a story about a fractured family. And I think that brokenness was something that I think that the story needed.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like that parallel, the brokenness of the timeline and the family, definitely lends itself to each other. And I felt that it also kind of had an underlying feeling of suspense almost to it that it added, because you're not getting, this happens and then this happens. You're getting, right, a bit more, pieces of information from further back or in the future. And so what did you kind of have in mind, which time periods that you were wanting to set this in at the beginning, or how did you choose what time period?
I knew vaguely. I wasn't sure exactly what year I wanted to start. I kind of knew we would be in maybe the 50s or the 60s, kind of around that time. A lot of it was just based on my family and things that my parents had experienced, and wanting to lean into that time. And I knew that I was going to be writing it, and to me there was something specific about this happening during Jim Crow, because Jim Crow is a system of binaries. There's a color drinking fountain, there's a white drinking fountain. Which one are you? So the idea of there being this very simple binary that people are forced into, and this town existing in opposition to that as this kind of third option, that felt really necessary that it exists in that time. I think most of the passing narratives usually take place earlier in time. So most of our most famous ones are, the 20s, 30s, 40s. So I remember when I was telling somebody about this book a few years ago, when it was set, she was just like, no, you set that too late in time. You need to set it earlier. But I didn't want to. I liked the idea of having this passing story take place into the civil rights movement and into the sort of post-civil rights movement. And this question of what does passing mean in the 1980s and like these other questions as time progressed and these rules of race become complicated and these performances become more complicated. The idea of the way that Stella's daughter thinks about race being so completely different than the way that Stella has been taught to think about race. All of that was something that became more interesting to me as we moved further sort of forward in time. So that's how I kind of got the ranges of dates. I wasn't expecting, I think, to go as deep into more contemporary time into the 80s and 90s. I don't think I was expecting to do that. But again, when I became interested in these daughters, then I'm thinking, well, what are their lives like? What happens when they leave college, or what happens when, so that's how I ended up a little bit closer to the modern day.
So talking about Stella and Desiree's daughters, we have a question in the Q&A. If you could discuss a little bit more about the consequences that the twins' choices have on their daughters and why each sister dealt with what happened to their dad in such very different ways.
Right. I think those questions are kind of connected to me. So to the second part, there's, an act of violence that they witness that comes pretty early in the book that they witness that happens to their father. And I think for that, I became interested in the idea of these twins witnessing this central act, but responding to it very differently. I think Desiree is able, they're both devastated and terrified. But I think Desiree is able to cope a little bit better. She's able to return to the site where this horrible event happens and lives a large chunk of her life there. Versus Stella is just running away from it. She, I think, is really bothered by the kind of illogic of what happened. She can't make sense of why this thing happened. She can't really accept why this thing happened. And I think that she remains haunted by it for her entire life. So to think about their daughters, I think what also became interesting to me was thinking about the ways in which we inherit things from our parents that we don't necessarily understand. So in the case of Jude, she has a close relationship with her mother. She knows, a bit about the family, and she knows what her mother has been through and what the family has been through. So even though she's kind of inherited this, the sense of running, the sense of restlessness, she has some context for it. But Stella's daughter, Kennedy, has no context because she knows nothing about what has happened to the family. And I think that was the moment where I really began to feel a lot of empathy for Kennedy. I think that she can be a character who's very easy to dismiss. And I started to feel a lot of empathy for her when I thought about the fact that, she has inherited her mother's trauma, but has no way to understand it. She does not understand why her mother is hypervigilant. She doesn't understand why, and that's not even to speak to her mother having this whole secret past that she doesn't know about, which of course those things are connected. But the idea of wanting to be really close to somebody and they don't want to be close to you and you can't understand why, that became deeply sad. And what does it feel like to grow up in that type of a household? What would it be like for Kennedy to experience this? So when I started to think about this book as intergenerational, that was the thing I think that I was really drawn to, was the idea of what the twins have experienced and also what they've chosen and also what they haven't chosen, these things that have just happened to them, the ideas of that trickling down into the lives of their daughters.
And you almost introduce the idea of the possibility of cellular memory as well, because Stella suffered from horrible nightmares after their father was killed, and then Kennedy also experiences terrible nightmares as well, but then can't remember what the nightmares were about the next morning. So I thought that was an interesting connection between the two of them as well.
Yeah, I mean, they talk about, trauma like affecting your genes, like your cells, like affecting you physiologically. And I've always thought that that was a really interesting idea, that we are marked by trauma in some way. It's not just the emotion of it, it's something that actually changes our bodies in some way. So I had a friend who read an early draft who was talking about the idea of like running being in everyone's genes within this book in some way, whether it's the twins running from home, Jude becomes a runner. Kennedy is always kind of flitting around. There's a sense of like having to constantly move, and that's something that is passed around among this family, and that's something that kind of links these characters.
Yeah, that was one thing that I liked, because I hadn't thought about that. That definitely, running is definitely a connection between those characters, because Kennedy runs off to Rome and stuff, and writes a postcard back to her parents saying, I have to go find myself. And Stella's reaction to that is, you can't go and find yourself, you have to make yourself. And so just this idea of how you figure out who you are between those two generations was interesting, how you introduced that too.
Thank you. Yeah.
So another character that I really enjoyed was Early. And I noticed, I'm wondering if this was intentional or not, but there are certain points, I noticed it more at the beginning of the book, and then again towards the end, where you kind of make little statements of like foreshadowing almost, or a little bit beyond foreshadowing, where you just tell like how a situation or a statement by someone affects that character in the future. And especially with Early, his character is a bounty hunter. There were certain ways that you described it that I kind of got this like almost detective noir sort of feel from that. Was that intentional?
I think a little bit. I kind of call Early a bit of a fake detective, because he's hunting people, and that becomes like an engine for the narrative. But you don't see him catch a lot of people like throughout the story, so that's not like a bulk of it. But yeah, I mean, I think that some of that came from, so one of the things that I was reading to think about this book was this book called Playing Dead, which is about faking your death. And I started to think about death faking as sort of akin to passing. That's kind of what Stella does in a sense, where she has to kind of remove this past life. She reinvents herself in this way. She, sort of psychologically and emotionally kills off her family and kills herself off to start this new life. But anyways, there was, the book is a fun book to read if anybody is interested in death fraud and how people get away with it, or how they don't get away with it, most likely. It's a fun book to read. It's a good conversation starter. If you want to talk about how you would fake your death if you had to. But one of the people in the book was somebody whose job was just to investigate these, instances of death fraud. And you get to see a glimpse of this person in this book whose whole job is just to hunt people who do not want to be found. And there was something about that became really interesting to me, and thinking about this character wandering onto the pages, whose job is to look for missing people. And the idea that there are so many characters in this book who are trying to reinvent themselves and completely detach themselves from their past. What does it mean to have somebody whose job is to kind of yank you out of your new life and pull you back to the past, whether that's because you have committed some type of crime or whether you're just hiding for some other reason. So I did love the idea of there being this kind of detective shadowy, he's sort of a shadowy figure, but who I also think kind of has a heart of gold. So I enjoyed the idea of kind of leaning into that. And I think it also, lends itself well to some of the settings. Some of the book is in New Orleans, and that's kind of a New Orleans vibe, I think, of this type of character who's doing this kind of barely legal sort of work. So I wanted to write it for a few of those reasons. But I think Early is people don't talk to me that much about Early, but he's one of my favorite characters, I think. I loved writing him. I just love a gruff man who feels a lot, I just have a soft spot for that type of character. So yeah, I enjoyed writing him a lot.
Yeah, I could tell. He was one of my favorites too.
That's good. I'm glad to hear.
So, did any of your family relationships or upbringing influence any of your writing for this book?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest is just I have two older sisters. I have two sisters. I'm very close to my sisters, and I think I'm always interested in themes of sisterhood because of that. I think of The Mothers as a book that was about sisterhood. It was about a chosen sisterhood between these friends, but it was about sisterhood, and I think that that's something I'm always thinking about, of both of the sort of the way that these bonds can be claustrophobic and can make you feel trapped, but also the sort of pain of separating from those bonds, and also just the ways in which it makes you think about identity of, you know, am I me because you are you, you know, or am I just, did I become this way because I was rebelling against who you are, or did I become this way because you like molded me into your mini me? You know, that's something I think about as a younger child a lot, of how many of my interests I have just because I wanted to be like my sisters who liked these things. So, you know, I think there's that way in which I was thinking about a relationship with my sisters and thinking about identity in the book. But I think also in thinking about the pain of that separation, because I kept thinking, you know, what would it be like to make a choice where I was deciding to never speak to my sisters again? And that is so unthinkable to me that it really, I think, gave Stella's choice a lot of emotional weight, and sort of translated it into terms that I could understand, because I've never been a person who would be in any position to pass for white. So that's not something I've ever thought about of navigating that type of a choice, but this idea of choosing to leave your sisters and never talk to them again and never have that relationship again, that was something that felt very, very real to me. So I think that it helped ground Stella for me and ground her choices in this way that felt very personal, and sort of meaningful as I was working on the book.
Do you feel like Stella, even though she's so entrenched in all the decisions that she's made, do you feel that she gets to a point where she regrets those decisions?
I don't know if I ever felt like she felt regret. I don't know. I mean, I think it's hard because I find regret like an uninteresting emotion to write about. I think that regret just feels, it's very inert. Like there's nothing you can do. It's sort of like guilt, you know, like there's nothing you can do with it. It just sort of feeds itself, and there's something that it's very static, a very static emotion. So I don't know that she feels regret. I think that to me, what became interesting about Stella was the idea of her passing, not even because she wants to be white. Like, it's not because she thinks that, you know, whiteness is better and she really wants to be white. It's really that she wants a new life. You know, she wants a life different than the one that she has. And she wants a life where she can feel safe. And that felt very real to me and very understandable. So I don't know that she would regret choosing that for herself. And I think it's also complicated because she loves her daughter, and she only has her daughter because of this life that she's chosen. But that being said, I do think that she feels, you know, probably a sense of guilt about leaving behind her sister and her mother. I think she does feel a lot of those different emotions, but I don't know if she would regret. That's a good question. I'm like, would Stella have done this again if like knowing everything that happens, would she have made the same choice? I kind of think yes, you know?
Yeah, that's what I think too.
I think yes, yeah. I think I'm always interested in characters making these choices that are sticky and complicated, but choices that they would probably do again. And I think that's the same is true of Nadia, I think, in The Mothers. I think she wouldn't have changed her choice, so.
So we touched on the success of your first book and how just phenomenal that reception was. Did you feel any, did that affect the way that you approached your second book? Did that give you, you know, extra pressure for coming up with a second one?
Yeah, I mean, I do think I felt pressure because the first book I wrote alone. I was working on it while I was in school. I had no agent, I had no editor. Nobody was expecting it or thinking about it. Nobody knew who I was or cared. Versus this book where I knew that I had sold it. I knew I had an agent who was asking me about it. I have an editor who's asking about it. And I knew also that there were readers who really connected to The Mothers very deeply and would be expecting a good book to follow it up. So I did feel that pressure. I think ultimately I had to just try to ignore it because I didn't want to write a book that was just like the mothers, but I also didn't want to write a book that was completely different than the mothers because I felt like I needed to write something completely different than the mothers, you know?
Right.
I just wanted to write the book that I wanted to write in whatever way that appeared, without being self-conscious about either doing what I had done before or doing the complete opposite of what I had done before. So eventually I had to just try to learn how to just push past that self-consciousness and just focus on the book that I wanted to write.
So we have a few more questions in the Q&A. There are a couple about Stella's relationship with her neighbor, Loretta.
Sure.
So her feelings seemed very complex and complicated with that relationship. Can you discuss a little bit about that and sort of how that sort of maybe affected Stella moving forward from that relationship?
Yeah. So yeah, when you eventually catch up with Stella, she's dealing with a crisis of a Black family potentially moving into her gated white community. And you know, again, when I was talking about the idea of Stella making choices that you don't expect, I think Loretta was one of those first moments for me of thinking about, you know, not only what if she tries to keep this Black family out of the neighborhood, but what if once they move in, she actually ends up leaning in and sort of becoming friends with this woman. It's not a choice that you expect her to make, I think, and it's not a choice she expects herself to make. But to me, that relationship with Loretta really underscored Stella's isolation and her loneliness within this new world. You know, the idea that she has chosen a world in which she is always going to be on the outside in some way. And what does that do to you after a while? This feeling that you can never let your guard down, you can never relax, you can never be yourself. You know, what does that do to you over time? And then what happens when you meet somebody who makes you feel a little bit like you can let that guard down and you can be yourself a little bit? So that to me was what became really interesting about that relationship was seeing, by seeing Stella in this relationship, I think you see really how lonely and how isolated she has been. And, you know, and at the same time, I think that the way that relationship unfolds is really a moment where she feels like she's kind of reached the point of no return in her sort of journey into whiteness. I think that that's kind of, you know, I kind of saw it as maybe like this is the last time that she would do anything like this. Like this is kind of the door slamming shut and this is her new life now. So I think it's a sad moment, but I think it also is a moment of seeing her gesture towards this friendship and also towards this sort of sisterhood that she wants to create with this woman who, you know, yeah, that becomes complicated by all of the other sort of social factors swirling around them. So that's what I found interesting about that relationship.
So we just have a few more questions in here. So are there, of course, I'm sure there are female authors of color that have inspired you or that you've been inspired by in your writing or just by reading them? Who would those be?
I mean, I think for me, the top ones are probably Toni Morrison and Alice Walker, I think would be probably my two. But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, it always feels obvious to say Toni Morrison because we all love her. But, you know, she was, I remember reading The Bluest Eye was the first Toni Morrison book I read that I stole from my parents' bookshelf when I was a child. I remember loving that book so much, and just loving the music and her language and the characters, and I think the strangeness. I think people often don't talk about how truly strange her characters are. It's very rarely there's kind of like an everyman at the center of the book. There's always something tilted in the way that's becomes really interesting. So I love that. And for as far as Alice Walker, The Color Purple was, you know, a hugely important book to me of just what fiction can do and the idea of thinking about, you know, the experience of racialized violence and gendered violence and how all these things collide. And also not only that, but thinking about how, you know, Black women can be liberated through relationships with each other. in whatever way those relationships form throughout the book, which are romantic, which are platonic and familial, and all of these different ways that community is sort of formed. So I think that those two, I think, have been really instrumental to me. And I think also, I don't think I talk about her that often, but I've been recently also thinking just about Terry Mcmillan, who I think really, I remember reading, her books back in, again, when I was probably too young. But I think that she wrote about, these messy and complicated Black women whose lives were not completely dictated by race. And not only that, but also proved that she could achieve mainstream success by doing that. So I think that she was always somebody whose work I found really fun and fascinating, and whose career I think I always admired because of that, her ability to sort of lean into these really messy characters who didn't have to be perfect and didn't have to be flawless. So I think those three have been really big for me.
What are you reading right now?
Ooh, that's good. I'm reading, I'm supposed to have like a kind of book club with my friends that, like many book clubs have gone astray a bit. We were supposed to be reading, I was supposed to have finished Rodham, which I'm enjoying. I'm 100 pages in. I'm really interested in the ideas of like kind of fictionalized biographies, or this is different, I think, because I think eventually it's going to veer off of the sort of historical record. But I read Joyce Carol Oates's Blonde, which is a fictionalized biography of Marilyn Monroe, which is absolutely insane, and just like the best way. It's just so crazy and really good. So the idea of like writing fiction from the persona of real people, I find to be really interesting. So that was one I was supposed to have finished, but I needed an extension just because life has been totally insane with the book out. So, but that's one that I'm working on right now. One of the people reading it is a gigantic Hillary Clinton fan, so I'm really excited to see his take. He's read several biographies of Hillary Clinton, so he has the inside knowledge. I'm just approaching it as a layperson. But so far, it's been really, it's interesting, and I think kind of daring to write from the consciousness of one of the most famous people in the world. So that's what I'm reading right now. But yeah.
So have there been any, have you been approached for film or a TV series adaptation of either of your books?
We have a film. The film has been optioned. The Mothers has been optioned by Warner Brothers with Kerry Washington producing. So I don't know what's happening with that because Hollywood has ground to a halt, as has most of the world. But that's happening. And for The Vanishing Half, there've been some conversations, but nothing has been set in stone. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I think a series would be awesome. So I will definitely look forward to that.
Okay, yeah, we'll keep our fingers crossed.
Yeah. So what has it been like for you? You've had this book written and you've been working on it for a while, and then it's coming out now where, not only are we in a pandemic, but the climate of the country and the world surrounding George Floyd and other things, the race related protests and things like that. How, knowing what your book was about and those events happening, how did that sort of affect you, and what was your thinking?
I think it's strange. Like you said, I worked on this book for many years. I did not think that when it came out, it would be framed as timely. I had been kind of prepared for releasing the book in a pandemic because I'd had a few months to kind of adjust to that being the reality. But I did not know that the conversation of the country would have turned so dramatically towards race, and not only the country, but the world. I did an interview this morning with the BBC where we were talking about this, and so I did not expect that. I think I think it's good that people are, turning to books in this moment and hoping to learn something. But I also hope that they read fiction for the beauty of it, and not simply as some how-to manual of how to be anti-racist. I don't think I've been asked, like, what do you want to teach people with this book? And I'm just like, I'm never wanting to teach people anything. So, if people learn, something, or they think, some people have written me very kindly and said that this made them think differently about identity, or made them think, and that's obviously great if the book complicates your understanding of identity in some way. But ultimately, I want people to enjoy the story. I want them to have emotional connection to the characters. I want them to think that the language is beautiful. I want them to come away with those feelings, and I hope that's what people experience.
Well, I definitely did, and I've seen some comments in the chat that others have felt the same.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. So, well, I think that is all the questions that we have in the Q&A. I think we've touched on both of those that are left. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
It was really, really great to talk to you, and hopefully we'll see you back in Tulsa again for your next book.
I hope so. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thanks, Magic City. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. I don't know if Jeff is gonna close us off, or.
All right.
Oh, you get me.
Pat.
Yeah. Thank you all for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it. We'll be back again Monday with Dr. Adam Goodman in his book, The Deportation Machine, and he's going to be in conversation with Dr. Linda Allegro from the New Sanctuary Tulsa, talking about immigration and America's long history with using deportation as a tool to keep the people they want out. And so that's going to be a fascinating conversation next Monday at 7 p.m. and then two great novels at the Wednesday and Thursday. Emma Straub on Thursday, Lara Prescott on Wednesday. I did it backwards, just like Jeff did at the beginning. So we've got those two going on, and then of course after the 4th of July, a great night with Colson Whitehead and Ben Montgomery on Monday the 6th. So thank you all for joining us tonight. We will see you again real soon.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.